Good afternoon, and welcome to the Voice of Wisdom. With over 60 years of experience as an investment banker, entrepreneur, investment analyst, economist, and venture capitalist, Morty Davis is Wall Street and capitalism personified. The over 400 companies for which he has raised more than $3 billion over the years have created a countless number of jobs and exciting new products. Through the Voice of Wisdom, Mr. Davis explores, analyzes, and debates the most topical political, economic, and social issues facing our world today. Joining Mr. Davis today for a discussion on affirmative action is the ever-brilliant Rabbi David Seidemann. To join the conversation, please call 332-263-3300. That's 332-263-3300. And now, Mr. Davis and Rabbi Seidemann.
Welcome back once again to the 6:30. I guess, suppose it's 6:30. It's a Jewish 6:30 because, as you may know, in Israel, the way they announce the time on radio, at the signal will be exactly this time. Will be exactly 10 o'clock, or maybe 10 after 10. Anyway, we're on a 6:30 startup time, but I got caught in traffic, so I apologize. And I have to tell you how much I appreciate Rabbi Seidemann waiting around for my appearance, because he's got another gig tonight. He's speaking in Queens. He's too popular, but he wouldn't miss speaking to my gathering of friends and listeners. Let me explain to you by way of a joke, one of my favorite jokes. What happened? I got delayed, and I apologize. I hope you hung around long enough to stay with me. But the way this joke goes is the Pope arrives at Kennedy Airport, the Pope, and he runs up to a cab driver and he says, "I got to get to the Waldorf Astoria in 20 minutes." And the cab driver says, "I can't do that." And the Pope says, "What do you mean you can't do it? I got to get there in 20 minutes, I'm telling you." He says, "Well, to do that, I'd have to go like 90 miles an hour. I'd have to go in and out. I'd have to violate every kind of traffic restriction, regulation, and so I can't do it." So he says, "Well, do it, do it. I'll give you a big tip." He says, "No, I can't. It's nothing to do with the tip." He says, and he takes out his license, and he says, "Look at all these marks I have on my license already. If I get one more mark on this license, I'll lose my license." So the Pope, as you can well understand, is very understanding and sympathetic. So he says to the cab driver, "You know what? I don't want you to lose your license. Why don't you go sit in the back, so you won't have to be subjected to the regulations, and I'll drive, and you won't be getting any more violations on your license. And I'll give you a big tip for that, so I can get there in time." So the cab driver says, "Okay, if you're going to drive, I'll sit in the back and get me, and I'll get to the Waldorf Astoria in 18 minutes probably." So the cab driver sits in the back. The Pope gets behind the wheel and he starts driving like crazy. He leaves Kennedy Airport. He's on the Van Wyck doing 90 miles, 85 miles, 103 miles. He keeps racing like crazy, zigzagging in and out. And all of a sudden you hear a siren. "Ah!" Cop stops him and he says, "You lunatic, you were going over 100 miles in an area that demands a 35-mile limit, a speeding limit." He says, "And you were jeopardizing people's lives, zigzagging in and out." And with that, he says, "I got to call the chief. I got to see what I got to hit you with." So he goes back to his car. He calls the chief and he says, "Chief, I just caught this guy on the Van Wyck Expressway, doing over 100 miles an hour at points, and no less than 90 miles an hour. He's racing like crazy. He's jeopardizing other cars. He almost had 6, 8 crashes just while I was watching. And what should I hit him with? So he says, what do you mean, what should you hit him with? Hit him with the book. Hit him with speeding. Hit him with reckless endangerment. Hit him with just everything, just hit him with the book. He says, the guy says, the cop says, I can't do that. He said, what do you mean you can't do that? Of course, hit him with the book. He said, yeah, but this guy's big, boss. So he said, what do you mean he's big? Is it the mayor? He says, no, bigger than the mayor. Bigger than the mayor? Is it the governor? He says, no, bigger than the governor. Bigger than the governor? Is it the president? He says, no, bigger than the president. He says, who the hell's bigger than the president? He says, I don't know, but the Pope is his driver. So if the Pope being his driver, obviously he's bigger than the president. So it's the same with me. I was on the way here and I got stopped because I was speeding all the way from my bedroom to the kitchen. I was speeding, and I finally made it. Anyway, thank you for your patience, and let's get started on the topic of the day, which is very timely because it's before the Supreme Court at this very moment, and that is how should we deal with the concept of affirmative action. In other words, the African American population, ever since slavery, has been left behind. At one juncture, they couldn't vote at all. Then subsequently, they were allowed, I think, 3/4 of a vote. They had, but to vote, they had to pay a poll tax. I'll get it right yet. A poll tax. And over time, they've reached the point where they are entitled to vote just as all the rest of us are. But in so many areas, they haven't caught up in terms of the schools in their areas. They live in the more depressed areas where the schools are funded with less funds because the money that's used to finance schools comes from the real estate tax that you and I pay. And in different communities, in wealthy communities, clearly people pay a lot more tax on real estate. And in poor communities, they pay very small real estate tax. So the budget of the schools in the depressed areas and the sort of the less elite areas, the ones that have more minorities, and particularly African Americans, have less good teachers, less good buildings, and so it's hard for them to catch up. And of course, it's considered unlikely. People who do the evaluations feel that the government does evaluations, find that they don't have quite the same opportunity to advance to get the education that the kids in the other wealthier communities get. So in order to address that and to make up for the years of slavery that we subjected them to, the recent approach has been, at least in the area of education and schooling, for them to get a preference and when they apply to college, so that they may get in with a somewhat lower grade average and school performance than the record of a white child or even an Asian child and so forth. Incidentally, it's really miraculous that the Asians who arrive here almost with almost no concept of the English language, or with a very little capability of speaking the English language, have risen to the point where the percentage of their population, I'll give you one example, Stuyvesant High School, which is considered one of the 4 best high schools in the New York area. Interestingly enough, the one on top of the list in New York is in the Staten Island High School. I never knew that. I discovered that in the research that I've done for this talk. And the other 3 are I think it's the Staten Island High School of Science or something. I don't recollect right off the bat the name. The others are Stuyvesant High School as on the top 25, way up there, Bronx High School of Science, and Brooklyn Tech. Those are the 4 top schools, including the Staten Island one. And the percentage of, as I recollect, the percentage of Asian students at Stuyvesant in particular, I have overall numbers for all the schools, but particularly for Stuyvesant, because when I was young, that was the number 1 high school in New York, and the top students were overwhelmingly Jewish. And so even though the Jewish population in New York was about 2% of the population, or 3% of the population at that time, they dominated the class. Almost over 50% were Jewish. And then the white population, for some reason I think the Jews were excluded from the white population when they did the count. But the white population was about, I'll give you the more recent numbers. Right now, the Asian population acceptance at Stuyvesant High School is about 74%. The number of whites is about 18%. The number of Latinos is about, I think,
3%. I think 3%.
no, I think it's for Stuyvesant. I think it's about 9% or more, and it's gone down. This year, the acceptance in a class of about entering class of about 800, I think it was 800, 900. This year, I think there were 6 African Americans accepted. 3 years ago, I think it was up around 12, and then it came down to 8, and now it's about 6. So just to square things, they want to find a way, there's been a great deal of agitation by the National Association and what is it called? The National Association of Colored People,
NAACP.
and the NAACP, and other who represent the black community, saying it's outrageous that the black population plays such an important role in New York City that it's inconceivable that only 6 out of the whole class, 6 African Americans were accepted, and about that same number, about 78%, 3/4 roughly, of 1,000 of 800, about 75% of 800, about 600 are Asian. So, and then there's been a lawsuit brought against Harvard, which likewise is one of the top destination of higher education and top schools in the country, top colleges of the country. has been accepting, giving a bonus to African Americans so they could qualify. So it might be that the qualification necessary for a white person, a white applicant, would be a 94 average. They would bring it down to a 83 average for. They'd give the black applicant a bonus so he could get another 15 points added to his application, so he'd be up at 95 or even higher. So Harvard's been very generous in that way and has increased the percentage of African American students attending Harvard undergraduate and even Harvard Business School and Harvard Law School. So that's the crux of the issue, and it's up before the Supreme Court right now, and we should get a decision sometime this year. But Harvard is fighting to retain that position, and several other colleges are on board with them. And the Supreme Court's going to have to decide whether that's fair, because a lot of Chinese that have far superior, or Asian, not only Chinese, Vietnamese and throughout Asia, what other Asian countries, Vietnam and Cambodia, all of the Asian countries, their students, many of their students who apply have complained by pointing out that they have higher educational attainments than the African Americans that are getting accepted, and they're excluded because there's there's only a limited number of openings, and some of the Asians are rejected because of that. So that's the lawsuit, and right now, because of the nature of the Supreme Court, it looks like Harvard's going to lose, and they will prevent institutions of learning from favoring the African American applicants, even though the argument is that we've kept them behind. They haven't had the same opportunity to achieve, and in an effort to bring on African Americans to the same level of achievements and resume impression, positive impression, as the Asians and the white applicants get. They're going to eliminate this advantage, so-called advantage, by not so-called advantage. It's really a bonus. They're going to add 15 points or something. So even though the African Americans' results are 15% lower, or 14% lower, they're going to wind up higher than the one that achieved a resume or an academic standard that's higher than the Asians. So the Asians are suing because they said it's reverse bias. It should all be based on meritocracy. I think I got it out. Meritocracy. Just as every sport, if you want to play for the New York Knicks, they don't say because there's less whites than blacks on the average NBA team that we need to put more whites on a basketball court when a game starts, and so we should give extra credit in some manner, shape, or form
To the short Jewish guy.
to the short, fat Jewish guy, right? Or to anybody that doesn't have a equal representation in proportion to their own percentage of the population. I mean, that goes throughout it. It's been a big issue that African American institutions and advocates have made with respect to the prison population in America. And the prison population, I think, don't hold me to it, but it's approximately 3/4 of the population and of the prison population in America is African Americans, and they represent only about 13-14% of the total population.
Yeah, well,
So their argument, the argument is, it should be more equal. It should be, the white population is a little more than 50%. It should be 50% whites. It should be 13 or 14% African American, and so forth. Somehow it hasn't worked out that way, and we can't bring it to fruition under the Congress or the Senate or the Constitution to remedy, or if it indeed it is remedying, adjusting it so that the amount of diversity is more equal, and those in a lesser participation should be somewhat advantaged, bonused, or rewarded, or their applications enhanced, so they can start to get a bigger proportion, or at least an allocation equal to their percentage of the population, of the total population. I won't carry on this numbers, and I think if you get me, you get the point. And if you have any issues with what I said, be my guest. I'm always open for abuse.
I'm ready to abuse you.
Okay, so let me hear from, I took up too much of your time, so let me introduce my great friend and genius, Rabbi, a very highly respected member of our community, David Seidemann. Do you have anything to say about?
I've got 5 hours worth of stuff to say. 5 hours.
I told you, he's a genius.
All right. Well, not because I'm a genius, but because you said things that are just so simplistic, and I say that with love and respect. And
or aggravating. Or aggravating.
Yeah, I don't get aggravated.
No.
But let me just, before I go into
You
the
don't
history.
you don't get aggravated
Not at this
by
age.
what many of them claim, many of our people claim, is unfair.
Well, let me address the unfairness, okay? Because you unwittingly echoed the argument of the Asians in this lawsuit against Harvard and against the University of North Carolina, I believe is the other institution. First of all, it's interesting, when hot button issues like this come before the Supreme Court, there's something called an amicus brief, meaning that you're not involved in the lawsuit, but you have an interest in it because it can somehow affect
Right.
you. I read, I follow the Supreme Court a lot. I actually teach a class on it. And there were more amicus briefs filed. There were 93 amicus briefs filed in this case. Right. 60 of them supported Harvard and University of North Carolina, and saying that we should keep this program in place. And only 33 were for chucking this program. But you said something that encapsulates the Asians' argument, and I'm going to, and it's really a departure from what I wanted to say.
I just want to make one thing clear.
Yes, sir.
I tried to represent the argument of the African American community
100%,
too.
100%. But something you said is so wrong and so
Harvard's-
off base.
And
I'm
Harvard's
gonna-
position.
Yeah, right. Yeah, but I just want to talk about the prison analogy that you made. You said that 13% of the population is black, but 75% of the prison population is black, and the numbers should be equal. You can't look at what is the prison population versus the black prison population versus the total black prison population in the country. You have to look at what percentage of the population is black or white when you compare it to the amount of crimes being committed by blacks and whites. You see, if only 13% of all crimes were committed by African Americans, then you'd be right. the prison population would have to match the population of the African American community. But if 13%, and I'm not saying this is true because I don't know, I didn't study these numbers, if 13% of the population is committing 50% of the crimes, then the population should be 50%, not 13%. Now, that touches on an entirely different topic, which we can talk about in the future, and that is, are blacks prosecuted at a higher level or a more severe level than whites? And if that is true, and it might be true, we'll talk about that another time, then you're right, the numbers are out of skew.
Well,
but
that's
to look at it,
No, I'm looking at it from the argument of the African American advocates.
Yeah,
and they're saying
you said that since they're only 13% of the population, they should only be 13% of the prison population.
That's not my position.
I got it, but if anybody who says that is off base.
The people who represent the they say we definitely don't. They don't believe they're anywhere near that. They say, we're pretty much the same.
No, I'm just saying you got to compare apples to apples and oranges to oranges.
The African Americans are arrested more aggressively.
True.
And they're indicted more.
True.
And they're incriminated more and put in jail more readily. And that's where the problem is.
Correct, but not that it should automatically only be 13%. And you're right.
I happen to agree with you.
Okay, I saw a study today that said that if you kill a white man, and the percentages are way out of whack. If you kill a white man, you are more likely to go on death row than if you kill a black man. So I agree, that's a completely different discussion. But I want to talk about, I read through a number of the briefs, 93 briefs, not all of them, not even most of them, but I read through a sampling, and I was able to pull from those 93 briefs 17 arguments in favor of the Students for Fair Admissions, and 17 arguments, I wrote it all down, 17 and 17, and 17 saying, scrap the whole idea. Now, what's interesting...
Which Fair Admissions has...
Fair Admissions has 17 good arguments.
Fair Admissions is a very, what do you call it, emotional...
Yes, well, that's the name they chose for the group. I get it.
That's not...
I get it, but one thing's very important.
Which do they...
The Student for Fair Admissions. Those are the plaintiffs.
Are those...
Those are the Asians in this case. They represent the Asians. And what they're saying is...
Because the African American representatives would say the fair admission...
Yeah, exactly. But for the names in this lawsuit, the Students for the Fair Admissions of the Asians, and the defendants, the respondents, are actually the universities, Harvard and University of North Carolina. What the Asians are arguing is as follows. You cannot remedy past discrimination by creating present discrimination. They're not denying that the African American has been prejudiced, has been denied opportunity. They're admitting that in their papers, if you read them.
Right.
They're not saying that that's a fallacy.
Right.
What they're saying is they're making two major arguments.
Should we be punished?
What do you want from us?
Right, we didn't...
Right, we weren't even here then.
Right.
So what do you want from us? That's the first argument they're making. The second argument they're making is that, there's the 14th Amendment, equal protection and due process. And that's the argument that Harvard and University of North Carolina is making, and that the University of Michigan Law School made in 2003 in the famous case of Grutter versus Bollinger.
Right.
They're saying the 14th Amendment, due process, equal protection, blacks, whites, Asians, Hispanics, everybody's equal. So the plaintiffs in this case are saying that if that's your argument, that everybody's equal, then we're just as equal as you are, and maybe you should be beaten up on the whites and not on the Asians. The second argument they're making three good arguments, I think. Well, let me rephrase that. They're making three good arguments that I think are going to persuade the Supreme Court justices. The second argument they're making to get rid of the affirmative action plan. Right. The second...
I just want to point out
that
even the way you defined it now, I'm representing now the black African American...
And I'm talking only about the Asians.
Advocates who are representing the position of the African American and the unfairness.
Right.
So even the definition of calling this the fair, what is it called?
The Students for Fair Admissions.
Right. but
No, they're saying make it as fair as the blacks.
no,
just like
no,
we
but
gave
the blacks would say we're the ones that are arguing
not
for
more
fair
than
admissions.
not more than the Asians. In other
No,
words,
but
that's,
once you define
I get it. I get it.
You've already
Okay, I didn't
indicated
choose the
a
name.
bias. That's what it
Right,
said.
right.
In favor of the
Yes,
you know,
but I didn't choose the name. But here's the second argument they're making. The second argument that they're making is that in Grutter versus Bollinger, 2003 case, the Supreme Court justices wrote in that decision that this decision has an expected shelf life of 25 years, because in 25 years, hopefully, we'll be at a place where
everybody will be satisfied, right?
The third argument they're making, which is, I believe, will be most persuasive with the Supreme Court, and which is the most contentious, and which you and I could talk for days about this, is, has affirmative action worked? When we said the African American, when we imposed on industries to hire a certain amount of African Americans, when we imposed on educational institutions to allow blacks, has the number of African Americans who are interested in that higher education rose in proportion to their segment of the population? In other words, like this. If I'm not interested in being a garbage man, or I'm not interested in being a heart surgeon, I don't fall into the category of people that can claim that the sanitation department is discriminating against me and the medical schools are discriminating against me, because I have no interest in applying. The only person who can make the argument, I want to be a lawyer, and I was denied the opportunity, is somebody who's interested. So when affirmative action started, Title VI and the 14th Amendment, and the Title VI applies to even private institutions, the 14th Amendment only to public institutions. When they created this animal, and I don't say animal in a bad way, I mean a good way, when they created this rubric of affirmative action, has it trickled down to the general population of the African community? And why is that important? Because in 2003, when they wrote this decision and said, we have to create affirmative action, the expectation was that the other people, the whites, the not Asians back then, but whoever would be eventually disadvantaged, would bite the bullet to bring the African American community up out of the low level that they're at.
Right.
But it hasn't worked. It hasn't worked.
Okay.
And therefore, one second, this is so important. When the government engages in a scheme that seems to discriminate against, in this case, Asians, the standard of review is a compelling state interest. And the Asians are arguing that a compelling state interest can only be substantiated if it produced results. And since the affirmative action did not produce results, the compelling state interest goes away. And therefore, the 14th Amendment and Title VI don't come into play. And one final point, then I'll let you talk, because I see you're as anxious as I was to talk. Another argument that the students for fair admission standards are making is that the petitioners are arguing a First Amendment right. Nowhere in the First Amendment does it guarantee somebody an education. Talks about freedom of speech,
right,
freedom of this, freedom of that. Nowhere in the First Amendment. So when the respondents frame their argument as a First Amendment argument, then you get into the issue of, hey, nowhere in the First Amendment are you guaranteed this. And when they frame it as a 14th Amendment or Title VI, then there's got to be a compelling state interest to impose a, on its face, discriminatory against Asians. And the way the courts have dealt with compelling state interest is whether that interest is going to produce results, and it hasn't.
Okay, no, I just want to respond to
Yeah,
that.
yeah.
And again, don't get me wrong.
Yeah.
Because I happen to feel personally that the right way to treat it is based on merit.
Right.
Just like the NBA, where you're talking about salaries that are 20, 30 million, even $50 million a year, there's hardly one white in the
Right.
whole league. And if you watch an NBA basketball game, there's always 5 on each side
Right.
playing, and if there's two white guys out of the
You
10,
think something's wrong with your TV.
right? I don't have color. I don't have color TV.
Right. And there's nothing wrong with that.
I don't have black and white
Right.
TV because it's all color.
Right, but Morty, there's nothing wrong with that. What that means
No,
is
but
that
let me-
I have no
let-
right
let-
to say they're discriminating
no,
against
let
me.
me finish
Yeah.
what they're arguing.
Yeah.
In this world, there's always two arguments.
Okay.
Nothing. It doesn't mean that both are equal in merit
Right.
or in fact or any. The argument that you raise is one of the reasons that blacks aren't interested in being a surgeon, perhaps, or top lawyers, is at the very birth they're starting off closed. They have no role models that were ever there. They have no awareness that's a career available to them or open to them. So they're saying it's not that we don't want our people don't want the same, what's
Opportunities.
What's very dominant discussion these days is everyone should be equal
Right.
under the law.
Right.
And some people say, well, clearly it doesn't look like Trump is treated the same way as the guy who's arrested for one identifiable violation.
Right.
And here they found innumerable violations that other people would probably be locked up for a long time. So in this case too, they're saying we never had it. It was never equal under the
Right. So what's the
opportunity.
answer? You know what the answer is? Don't tell the University of Michigan and don't tell Harvard and don't tell the University of North Carolina that you have to allow more African Americans in. You might be able to say that, but if you really want to get to the root of the problem, don't deal with the disadvantage that the African Americans have. Don't wait till they get to law school to deal with it. Start in kindergarten. Make them want to go to law school. Make them want to go to medical
I'm
school.
all with you.
That's
And-
why affirmative action's not working, because you can't wait till they get to the workforce and you can't wait till they get to medical school or law school. They have no desire to because they haven't been given the opportunity to develop the desire to. You have to start in kindergarten. You have to say Clarence Thomas should be your role model. Any other African American that made it in the corporate world, in the business, in the medical, in the legal, that should be your role model.
Right.
You do that, then I believe if that doesn't work, then you can tell Harvard and University of North Carolina and University of Michigan, you got to even it, you got to balance it out.
Oh, look.
But until you make them want it,
Look, I want to give you, just from personal experience during my long life. Number one, there are African Americans that make it big. Nobody may be bigger than Colin Powell,
correct.
who's considered way
Susan
before-
Rice.
even before Obama as a
Right.
presidential
Correct.
candidate. He was head of the armed forces. He was just a phenomenal, looked up to, and he's just one example. And he says it's really because it shows the difference. He says one of the differences in his life, he speaks Yiddish fluently.
Right.
He says, I worked in the Bronx in a hardware store, and my boss was a Jewish owner. He owned the store. And overwhelmingly, his clients, his customers were Jewish. So over time, he learned to speak Yiddish. But he said there came the time for him to graduate high school, and he wanted to prolong his career with this Jewish owner, who Colin Powell said he respected a great deal. The Jewish owner told him, don't continue working for me, even though you're a valuable asset, I'd love to keep you. Go to college, and then he guided him. He was a role model for him on how to move forward. So we all need some role model that
Right.
we can find.
Right.
Unfortunately, in the African American community, there aren't enough role models for these young people. The role models are the winners in their community. Who are the biggest winners? Driving the stretch Cadillacs,
yeah.
and
The rap stars and the basketball stars, right?
And very showy. So the biggest winners are the ones that are marketing marijuana and illegal drugs. So when I grow up, I want to be like him. Look at he's driving a gold Cadillac.
Right.
I'll give you another interesting example. Some years ago on WABC radio, they had a discussion of the progress of African Americans in the U.S. and had 5 participants. So 4 of them were saying what we need more of is more support. We need more welfare. We need more food stamps. We need more whatever.
Could be given out. That's what they wanted, right?
More,
More handouts.
more opportunities in the fields that pay the most, these kind of things. And there was one fellow from the University of California. California has a university system that's run by the state. So it was either UCLA or USC or one of the top schools there in there. And he was saying, what we need is more of our people staying married, more fathers
Staying at home,
more mothers spending time reading to their
children.
kids
Right.
and being home when they're the extreme response incident to that over the years. Back maybe 35 years ago, there was a proposal by somebody in New York, one of the legislatures, that said for some of these African American young women that already had 4 or 5 kids and were never home, clearly not
Motherly children.
not giving their kids a shot at life. If you or I were brought up in that environment, we'd also be in jail, probably.
Right.
Or if we weren't in jail, we'd be.
Not performing the way we should.
So they said they would give those kind of women a $50,000 bonus to tie their tubes.
Right.
It's not saying you can't have kids. It's saying
If
after
you want to-
after you have 4 or 5 already, we want you to stop having and spend more
Right.
time, developing the ones you have or avoiding them being so neglected and more influenced by the negatives in the community than the role models. So it was
I can
it was
imagine.
beaten up so badly. It was.
can imagine.
It was called. What is it? What do they call it? Genocide.
Racial genocide. But Morty, can we agree that after
No, but
25, 30 years...
You know what they? But the guy who was speaking up and saying we need more of this, and another guy that was a hero, who was my hero, until he got into this trouble, is the guy who had the #1 radio show, television show.
I thought that was you.
No, it was almost me. The black guy who's in trouble now for drugging, presumably drugging many of the aspiring women that came to him for advice because he was such a superstar.
Uh-huh.
And he had invited him for a drink or something.
Right.
He was so nice.
Let's get back on topic.
What's his name? Jordan.
Oh, Bill Cosby.
Bill Cosby.
Yeah, Bill Cosby.
Bill
right.
Cosby.
Okay, but let's get back
so
on
Bill
topic.
Cosby lectured precisely this way.
Right. I remember.
And the guy who from University of California, the other 4 people, every time he spoke up, they said, "You're an Uncle Tom. Keep quiet."
Right.
Because he was telling them,
Live a different life.
different
priorities.
Don't ask society to fix it. You fix it within your community by demanding that the male
That a father be a father and a mother be a mother. Yeah, simply said.
First to them to stay. We even inspire them and incentivize them, because if they got divorced, they were more easily awarded government support, welfare. If they stayed married, it was less accessible to them.
Right. Listen, I think we can agree that affirmative action, as it's presently constituted, has not worked. And then there's only 2 conclusions. It's because because the white community hasn't done enough, or because the African American community has not taken advantage of what was given. And I'm sure it's on an individual basis. But I want to make one very interesting point about where I think the court's going to go with this, or where they could go. The court could say, we're leaving things as they are. I doubt it. The questioning of the justices yesterday or Monday made it clear that they were not going to let it stand as presently constituted. But there are two choices. They could say scrap the whole program. Racial history cannot have any part in college admissions or in any hiring. Or they could say the state still has a compelling interest, but as presently constituted, the way you've developed the system by giving extra points is not fair. That's interesting. You mentioned before about giving 14 or 15 extra points on their scores. When I read the briefs, I saw something different. There's an entire subjective category called your personal score. Yeah. And that's where the African Americans were given consistently the top number, and the Asians were given in every single case the lowest number. And that's what Justice Clarence Thomas seized on. He said to the lawyer who was arguing on behalf of Harvard, he says, I've seen the numbers, and it means one of two things. There's not one Asian with any integrity and a compelling life story, or your system is screwed up. So the problem is the subjective nature of the advantage that's being given. And I'm not saying that there shouldn't be some remedial program, but to have a program where coincidentally every African American is getting a 4 and a 5 on his personal score because of his compelling life story, and every Asian is getting a 0, statistically it just shouldn't work out that way. There's got to be an Asian with a good story.
They probably could find one.
and listen, the Asians came to America and we're not
what do you mean? They're miraculous. They come here with no English, no English ability. The African Americans are here for more than 200
and
years.
And the Jews, when they came from Europe.
So you think that they'd have a big edge.
Yeah.
But you want to know the counter-argument that the black advocates representing the interests of the African Americans are saying? There was never an affirmative program.
Okay.
You know, it was a token. There were a few blacks who and those, some of them did well. But you can't judge a program that has a token, less than a few blacks to satisfy their guilt that they haven't done the right by over the years. Just like they're asking for, what is it called?
Reparations, yeah. There's one school in California which actually had a program like this and scrapped it, and African American enrollment dropped by 50%. So there is an argument to be made that without some sort of remedial program, that the African Americans will continue to be disadvantaged. I think the problem with what they have with the Harvard and the University of North Carolina system is that the way it's presently drafted, it's just so subjective. And so, I like this, he's African, I'm going to give him a 5. He's Asian, I'm giving him a 0. There's no way to measure it. And that is inherently biased.
Let me tell you something interesting. I'm totally for based on merit, the way the NBA has it.
Right.
There's no issue. A guy's either better or worse, at least in that kind of thing. Right. It's easy to do. And in sports in general, it's all based on merit. You could have the best connections. Your father could own the team. They're not gonna put you on a team and destroy their competitive.
Right. Just because you're wearing a yarmulke, I'm not drafting you.
But notwithstanding that, in our world where we say merit counts, almost 50% of the people that get accepted at Harvard are not accepted because of their superior George Bush,
43% are there
George-
because of donations or because their father
George
legacy.
Bush never had, he had a
Right.
C average. He could have never got into Harvard Business School because there's a lot of, a classmate of mine became the dean of the Harvard Business School. And at one of the, I think my 25th reunion, I asked him, how has it changed since you and I went? Is it much different? He says, first of all, when he and I went, 10% of the class was dropped out.
Right.
Why? Because we had no issues. There were no blacks. I didn't have one black out of 570 students. Somebody told me there was one black. I never met him. I think he was mistaking the guy who was cleaning up after us after we broke up.
But he really wasn't a
group.
student. Yeah.
But say there was one.
Right.
So it was supposedly all on merit.
Right.
And 10%, notwithstanding that 10% got dropped out, and you knew, they told you that going in, that 10% of the class will be dropped out.
And they only accept 10% of all their applicants every year. So the Asians' argument is we're already starting behind the eight ball. There's 3,500 applicants for Harvard Law School a year. They only take 350. So now they're fighting for 350 spots, and you have 43%
Say that
are
again.
going.
10%.
10%. They only accept 10% of their applicants.
Right.
That's what Harvard takes the first year of law school.
10%.
10% of all the applicants.
Right.
So now
And they reject.
they reject 90%. They
Right.
only accept 10%. 43% of the people they accept, or of the acceptees, are there on legacy. Their father gave money, their father went there, their uncle's the
Right.
dean. So now how many spots are left open for the African American or the Asian? This is the first generation of Asians here. So their father didn't go to Harvard, and unless they made $1 million, their father's not the dean. So
Well, that's based on merit. If you weren't born white, you don't have the merit to go.
right. So the question is, what would have been if this lawsuit was started not by a group of Asians, by a group of whites? The Supreme Court's decision might be completely different, because some of the arguments that the Asians are making is not an argument that a white person can make.
Why not?
Because they could say we're just as disadvantaged. We're also first
they couldn't make
generation.
the-
Yeah. So that's what's very interesting about this
So
case.
why does why?
Well, this case was started by a group of Asians. So
No, but this idea that merit, because I'm in favor of merit, but it's not based on merit.
But it can
Because
be
it's a
on
very-
merit.
but
It
it's-
can be,
but it's
Morty,
not.
if
Even
we
where-
start in kindergarten.
Even where we claim it's on merit,
Got it. 43%, correct.
Harvard it allows in the ones with big donation, so it's imperfect.
Now you
At
know
the
why I
end-
didn't go to
but the-
Harvard.
But the NBA is perfect. The
Right.
NBA
All
then-
merit.
all merit.
Right.
So how do you change merit, or how do you introduce merit across the board? And that Harvard would resist, because then they wouldn't be able to get the donations. My kids, because I went to Harvard Business School, my brother went to Harvard Business School, his kids, both his boys got in, and they deserved it, even if they weren't, his father wasn't, and he wound up being a professor at Harvard. So they had an edge, but I'm saying it is imperfect, and you can't make it perfect.
Right, but
And-
why do you need, as you said, why does the basketball team go only on merit, but the law school has to be some other metric? And the ironic thing is that unless we change the education of the African American from kindergarten, they're going to continue to want to grow up being the basketball player and not the lawyer. Sure, you will get your Colin Powells and your Susan Rice. You will get phenomenal African American doctors and African American lawyers, but it doesn't represent enough of their population to say that affirmative action is working.
Look, I worked on Staten Island as a door-to-door salesman, and I'm Jewish, so they talked to me about the religion and different things. I became friendly with the women that I was servicing because I sold on installments. So every week I saw them again and again and again when they opened the door for me. They didn't lock me out and hide from me. But I became friendly with a large number of them, and they all admitted to me they hate Jews.
Yeah.
And I say, why do you hate Jews? Well, they don't know, but the Jews dominate, the Jews own everything, the Jews are... It was, not an explanation that justifies it, but
Right.
that's
Reality
what they
at that
grew-
moment,
right.
that was the reality.
Right. But a few of them told me over time that I wish my daughter would marry a Jewish husband.
Right.
So I was taken aback. I said, what do you mean? You always tell me how you hate Jews and Jews are the worst. And they'd say to me, that's different. The Jews don't beat up their wives.
Yeah.
And the Jews bring the, what do you call it?
The wives beat us up.
Right. And the Jews bring home, the Jewish husbands bring home their salaries to the
family.
to the wives.
Yeah.
Because they used to go meet their husbands at Friday afternoon when they picked up their paycheck to get the money before the guys would blow it at the bar or gambling or whatever. So they said those were the two reasons they wanted a Jewish. So they became unbiased in a sense when that happened. It's an imperfect world. We'll never get perfection, even when we say supposedly Harvard is separate from this issue. Harvard was always considered, and most of these schools were always considered based on merit.
Right.
But it's not. Anyway, we have a
Lot
caller
of
that
work
wants
to
to
do,
take
yeah.
issue with not with me, because I'm for merit, and you're for. In a way, we both agree. I'm not.
Well,
I'm just presenting the position of the
African Americans, and
I want to tell you another thing. There was no greater friend to the African Americans than the Jewish leaders. Or the founders of the NAACP were all Jewish lawyers.
Yes, they were.
The two guys that died during the civil upheaval, in the South when they were trying to get equal schooling.
Right.
With I even remember their names. 2 out of the 3 were Jewish.
Yeah, sure.
Schwerner and anyway, so the Jews and notwithstanding that, they always are angry at the Jews and hate the Jews disproportionately.
That's another.
Human beings are imperfect,
Right.
and
Right.
till we find an outer space enemy that we could all hate together, so we coalesce, we join together to hate that outer space. Human beings always need somebody to
An
hate.
enemy. Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Len, is there somebody on, or
It should be. Hannah's supposed to be on. Hello?
Hi. Hey, can you all hear me?
Sure. How are you?
Oh, good. I'm okay. Good to hear you both. First, just one thing about that 43% number you guys were talking about. That was 43% of all whites admitted to Harvard were there on, that sort of legacy block. 43%, almost half of the whites, not of everyone, just of the whites. And then that same study went through and looked at them, and 75% of those people would not have qualified for Harvard.
Correct.
When
I
it
saw
comes to
that.
meritocracy, that is not what we have, and that's not what we have ever had. And the whole point of this is that the unnatural advantage that people like this have needs to be in some way compensated so that people will. I mean, I don't think anybody's saying that the people who are applying to Harvard and getting in are, unqualified people. That they bombed their SATs, that they, had C averages. That's what's happening with these white legacy students. But, I don't think the Asian students are saying this. I don't think anybody's saying this about the, people who actually made it into Harvard as a minority. Another important thing to think about here is that Asians at this moment represent 25% of every class at Harvard. 25%, far outpacing their actual representation in the country. So they're not the people that and the number that you brought up about Stuyvesant, I think, wasn't it that 70% of the kids at Stuyvesant now are Asian?
Something like that,
No,
yeah.
no, my
Yeah.
numbers were reversed. My numbers said 72% white, 18% Asian. Do I have it backwards? Because you said the opposite.
At Stuyvesant?
For Stuyvesant?
No, I mean, one of my good friends' white son was, one of 10 in his graduating class.
White or Asian?
Stuyvesant, no. Stuyvesant is majority Asian.
Okay. All right, my numbers are reversed. Okay.
Okay. So, but the point there about Stuyvesant is that 100% of the admissions process is based on testing, not on, and by testing I mean, those sorts of multiple choice, the fill in the blank testing, not necessarily on writing, not necessarily on anything to do with other, creative thinking, but, on testing.
So it's objective.
And so that's,
It's objective.
No, they argue it's not objective because
well,
it's
objective
designed
of
by
a
whites
set of
that don't have the
criteria.
same experience.
But I'm gonna assert that in and of itself is subjective, but that's a whole. Tell you what, that's a whole other thing.
The way the
There's a couple
tests are
other,
designed.
important points I want to bring up. One is that, it's sad that this is going unspoken for most of all of the conversations that I hear around the country about this right now. White women have been the primary beneficiaries of affirmative action. Because prior to this, we were, representing, equal numbers as white men in the country. Before any of the affirmative action programs, we were somewhere between, 20 to 30% of college students. After that, we are now at, post these programs, we are now outpacing men in terms of admission and the rate at which, people are successfully graduating. So there is something to getting in when you can qualify, getting in even though you don't match the preconceived idea. And along those lines, I'm going to say that to me mirrors the family situation that you guys have been talking about, the cultural situation, but also the intergenerational piece of it. 20 years, and it's 20 years now, it hasn't yet reached 25 years, but 20 years is basically, not even how we measure generations. We're less than a generation into this. And so if you're going to start developing role models and people at multiple layers in society, it just seems, I don't know, it just kind of boggles my mind that we're going to think that it's going to happen within a generation.
Can I ask you a question?
Two,
Can I ask you a question? Do you think it'll change in 50 years from now? Do you think
Well, I'm actually incredibly pessimistic about how we're going to do as a country, personally.
Yeah, well, that's another discussion.
So I don't want to project on that, but I just talking about right now. The other thing, though, is, and I don't understand how we can say that affirmative action has been a failure when you look at college graduation rates among African Americans, going up every year for the last 20 years. So why would that not be seen as a positive, as an affirmation?
I'll explain it. Because the percentage that you just described, you're describing the percentage of the class, but you're not talking about the percentage of the African community. The African community.
No, I am.
No, you're not.
No. I just pulled up the studies. African Americans are. Hang on. Here we go. College enrollment of blacks. Okay, so that's of within the cohort, and the cohort being black. We've got. It went from less than 1% to over 2.35. All right, that's moving in the right direction.
And
so the 25% I was talking about was about Harvard, uh, the percentage of Asians in a Harvard class right now.
let me rephrase the question. What percentage of the African American community males graduate high school? What percentage of
Well,
the
I don't, if you give me the database, I can figure that out for
Okay.
you, but I don't have that at hand.
But it's
I can
nowhere
say male
near.
and female, on any given year, we've got, we have at least a percentage point increase every year, which is, and that's within, the right age cohort. I'll be happy to go dig for other stats.
Call back next week and we'll deal with it because we're running to the end of our time.
The gains anticipated by a court decision that allowed for affirmative action to remedy and to bring the oppressed out of the gutter has not worked. It hasn't. It's opened opportunities for very, very few people, and I'm not saying whose fault it is. I'm just saying it gives the Asians a great argument to say you have no right. There is no longer a compelling state interest to deny us what we should get on merit to remedy a problem which A, we didn't create, and B, your solution is not working.
What I would say the solution to that is to only let the legacy students in that qualify.
Oh, I
and
agree.
Then you're not taking away from any of the others. The people who they're actually competing against are unqualified people who are white.
Okay.
What's her name? Anna, thank you for your call. Great call. Call back next week and we'll continue this.
Okay.
I just want to wrap it up
Okay.
by finishing what my classmate I started to say, who became a dean. I said, what's changed? Is it the same or different? He says, number one, we can't drop out 10% of the class or even 1% of the class. Because when you and I went, it was all white guys and there was no problem. As a matter of fact, one of the guys they dropped out in my class, and I met with him after years later, he dropped out because he didn't match up, was a guy named Mac Aldrich. And all of the three major buildings there opposite the classrooms, colonial type buildings, beautiful, dorms, were all named after former secretaries of the Treasury. And Aldrich was one of the former secretaries of the Treasury. He also happened to be a Rockefeller Aldrich. And notwithstanding that, he got kicked out. So it was really based on merit, to the best of my knowledge, because you can't be bigger than that, have a building there named after your family. And then he said, but now we have women in the class. You had no women at that time, but that's not even the issue. But we have a lot of African Americans and Hispanics and so forth. So we don't drop them out anymore. What we do is if they don't match up, we ask them to take a leave of absence, and we will help them during their off years when they're not attending to improve their capacity. But of course, once the experience is once they give them what is it called, a furlough, and say take the time off and get prepared. You're not being kicked out. You're just being furloughed for a while. Most of them don't even bother coming back. So that's number one. Number two, he said he spends more than 25% of his time in court. You know why he spends so much time in his court? He says in New York, there's a woman that's suing them that her daughter is it's 100% A student. Every course she's ever got was A in high school. She's captain of the tennis team, and she's president of her class. So she says, how could you possibly reject her? She went to court. And he explained to the judge and whoever else made the judgment, he said, look, we get so many applicants from New York and Massachusetts that are so qualified, and we have to reject because we have an allocation. If you're from Ukraine or some third world country, Zimbabwe, we get one application every 10 years.
Right.
We take them in.
Right. Diversity.
So it's allocated. If we get an application from Wyoming, we get very few. So we take them in. So unfortunately, it's never fair.
Right. And Anna, let me make one last point, and then I really have to run. Another reason why allowing somebody in not based on merit is not the greatest of ideas, because if you're now a major player in the legal profession, right? You want to hire a law
Right.
firm. You want to hire somebody for your law firm. Now, who are you going to hire? You're going to hire somebody who had the better grades and the better background, or you're going to hire the person who made it in to law school only because of a special accommodation. So what favor are you really doing? Are you really opening up another opportunity, a true opportunity for this person? If I was hiring somebody, I'm looking at his grades, his performance in the classroom, his performance as it relates to the other students. And if I find out that somebody really didn't deserve to be there, and he was only admitted because he was given a subjective, arbitrary score of 5 on his personal background story, I might think twice. Maybe I would hire him, but I would think twice. I don't know it's not trickling down to the next generation, but I don't even know if we're doing this fellow a favor, because he might not get the job he thinks he's going to get. Okay, I got to run, Morty. I love you.
I just want to close by saying, I'll give you my prediction of what's going to happen.
And I'll give you mine. The Jets are not making it to the Super Bowl.
That's it. Remember this. We're going to go back at them at the end of the season.
That's right, end of the season.
I agree.
But neither are my Cleveland Browns.
I agree with you on that too.
Neither are my Cleveland Browns.
Are you a Cleveland?
I'm a Cleveland Browns fan.
Anyway, see, now you talked me out of it.
You say a prediction of what you think the Supreme Court's going to...
They're definitely going to reject Harvard and adhere to the Chinese argument, the Asian argument. Or, if they really want to cop out, they will do what they did recently and say, well, it's not in the Constitution, we won't deal with it. Since it's not in the Constitution, it's a state's right. Anything
Right.
that wasn't defined specifically and then in that case, we know what will happen.
It depends where you live.
Right. In Alabama, they'll never have another black get to college.
Right. And in New York, who knows? All right, Morty, thank you so much.
You did a great job.
Didn't I?
Really?
I'm amazed.
No, I'm not.
And I got this job on merit, didn't I?
Absolutely.
Okay.
No, but I was surprised because I told you the last minute. I didn't tell you what the subject is a week in it.
Listen.
And it turns out you did so much work on this.
What do I do all
I
day?
could have listened. No, I could have listened to you, like you said, for hours and hours and hours.
Yeah, this is
'Cause
such a great